Ready. Play.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever time it is in the world, wherever you're tuning in from. I'm really pleased to have with me today Jeff from Tennis Abstract. Jeff, how are you doing today?
Great. Thanks for having me, John.
Good. I know we've been in conversation a little bit in the last week or two, but many people will be familiar with Tennis Abstract a lot more than even I am. And in fact, I'm kind of using today's interview, Jeff, as a learning process, because what happens to me is I'm in the middle of a match talking about X match, and I'm with Damien or Nick or Jack or Vanch and many others that maybe you may or may not be familiar with in terms of the tennis Twitterverse. And I'll be like, well, how many times has he or she lost in a deciding set at a Grand Slam on a Wednesday afternoon in March? Well, of course, there are no Grand Slams in March, but Jeff, excuse my little error there. And they will be on your website checking out very small and obscure things. And within a very short space of time, they will come back to me with an answer. And I'll be like, oh, where did you get that from? Oh, Tennis Abstract. And yeah, so I want you to tell my audience a little bit about who you are, what you do, and kind of what's on your website.
All right. Well, I'll try to give you the quick rundown. I started Tennis Abstract about a decade ago, maybe a little more than a decade now. And for years before that, I was a baseball analyst, first as a hobbyist, and then I started a company that still exists. It's still my day job that provides amateur baseball stats to Major League Baseball teams. And as you probably know, like baseball is where this whole sports analytics revolution started. So if you were a baseball fan in 2005, like I was, then you read Moneyball, you see all this stuff happening online. Like if you're a math minded person, then this just kind of flips your world upside down. And there were great baseball websites out there, Baseball Reference, Fangraphs, and what you described about how people use Tennis Abstract, that existed 20 years ago for baseball. People could just flip through these websites, find everything they ever dreamed of and more. And as soon as I was a tennis player growing up, and I've always been a big tennis fan, but eventually I thought, what the hell, let's try to do this for tennis too. I was, getting a little burned out on baseball. So I figured I'd try to build the same thing for tennis, or find it if it existed. I didn't know whether it existed or not. So when I discovered it didn't exist, there wasn't this like database you could just go and access and mess around with. I built it myself. And the idea was just to build the site that I wanted, that baseball fans had already had for a decade, where if you wanted to look up a player and see every match they ever played, and every match at Grand Slams, or every match against lefties, or like you say, this or that, and drill down to whatever level of focus you want. I wanted to have that. So I ended up building it. And that's ultimately what Tennis Abstract is. And over the last 10 years, it's grown in all sorts of different directions and gotten a little out of hand in some of those directions. So there's more information there than I'll ever look up, or most people would ever even realize they could look up. That's part of the fun of it. So, I think the people who end up like your friends who are just on there digging around are the ones who play around with it and experiment. I think that's one thing that we've kind of lost in the last 20 years of becoming internet people, is we've lost a sense of exploration. That just there's this crazy, amazing stuff online. So let's just click some links and see what happens and see what we can find. And I think if you go to Tennis Abstract with that in mind, you'll discover there's some pretty cool, some weird, some pointless things, but mostly pretty cool things that you can discover if you experiment a little bit and see what's there.
I want to experiment a bit with you, Jeff, in a minute or two. But before we get to that, I just had a couple of random thoughts. One was that Al Gore famously said just over 20 years ago that the internet would mean the end of fake news, because it would be a chance for us to check. So I would say something maybe outlandish, and you go, hang on a second, I'll just check that. But of course, as we know, I think it's probably taken fake news to a new level. But the other thing was that I also noticed that you've been doing a bit of writing. Now, I don't know if that's more of a recent thing, Jeff. For example, there was something I caught my eye recently, because a lot was being said in the second week of the Australian Open about Arina Sabalenka and Sabalenka under pressure. But then you recently wrote an article on Sabalenka and her ability to deal with pressure, or her pressure points, or what she was actually doing in these exact moments. Can you tell us a little bit about that article first?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, one thing that's frustrating about any endeavor where there isn't good stats or analytics is it's very easy to create a story. Like something happens and we generalize from it. So, like with the example I gave in my article is Sabalenka got in a long rally with Coco Gauff, lost the rally, and then probably felt under some pressure since I think she was down 15-40 or 15-30 something. And she came back and she double faulted on the next point. So, I mean, the narrative writes itself, right? Bad thing happened to Sabalenka against the worst possible opponent. She's under pressure. She tries to serve bigger. She's feeling it. She had the yips a couple of years ago. Like, I mean, you can write the whole story, right? So she double faulted. Bam, there's your trend. Only if you check and look at every time somebody, whether Coco Gauff or somebody else, dragged her into a long rally that she didn't want to be in, and then put her in a hole, and she came back and served, most of the time, she actually served as well or better than she normally does. So even though the story writes itself from that one example, when you look at all the examples, which I mean, it's impossible for us to do with our puny human minds to actually think back to all the past examples of that happening. But with a computer and some code and a good database, you can go and check every single one, and you can find out, is this really happening more than we'd expect? Or are we just paying more attention to it because it fits some kind of preconceived narrative? And in this case, Sabalenka sure doesn't look like she has it all under control all the time. I love Arena, but it definitely doesn't look like she has it under control. But the numbers say she does. At least in that type of scenario, she bounces back really well. And she doesn't, the yips don't get her, the double faults don't get her, whatever it is. She comes back and she rescues herself from those situations. And that's certainly proved out in that case against Coco Gauff. Aside from that one example, she pulled out of what could have turned into a big mentally disastrous mess, and she won the match. And over the last few years, that's what she's consistently done.
Yeah, right. I mean, the expression confirmation bias theory springs to mind a little bit with Arena. I mean, the semi. We know about the yips, and I think if we put that in isolation, it's like fine. There was an issue there, whether it be technical, whether it be mental, or probably a bit of both. But if we put that to one side, especially when we look at the last 2 years, which is where she's had more pressure than ever before, she's kind of just performed, at least on to mine, looking at the results and looking at the way she plays, she's done okay. She's won 2 Grand Slams in 3 Grand Slam finals, which to me as a ratio doesn't seem too bad. She's won, I think, 3 now out of 8 Grand Slam semifinals, which again just seems to be quite good. But there's this thing with pressure. She's still got the semi-final, tag, if you like, because we can't, as humans, get that out of our mind that quickly. And yet, really, if we looked at the data closely, as you did with that article, she's certainly no better or worse, or maybe even slightly better than every player. Even Novak Djokovic recognized recently that he has feels the pressure, and most of the time he deals with it okay. But that is that. Tell us about any other articles you've written recently, Jeff.
I have been writing a lot recently, and I mean, just as a background, I've been keeping up that tennis blog since it's been more than a decade. I think there's close to 1,200 posts on that blog, so you can dig back into the archives. What I've been trying to do since the beginning of this year is write specifically about active players, not necessarily the very best like Sabalenka or Djokovic, but I've been trying to dive into the stats and say something about the games of players you might not be thinking about. My theory basically is that every player is interesting. If you talk to even super fans, you'll sometimes get a different idea that, there's a few players that are super interesting, but then there's all these Eastern Europeans and they're all the same. I'm paraphrasing, but there's this idea that there are a few big stories and everybody else is kind of a blur. And I would say that out of 100 players in the top 100, I'm hoping I can write an interesting article about, 95 of them. Maybe not in a short period of time because it takes a long time to write these things. But like this last article I wrote, I see you've got my main page up there. Last one is about Diana Yastremska, so a player who before the semifinal in Australia, no one was thinking too much about. I wrote one about Yuri Lehechka. Just trying to dive into these players who are interesting in and of themselves, but maybe we don't think about too much. I mean, coming back to the comparison with team sports and baseball again, if you think about whatever team sport you follow, think of how many players you think are superstars or really interesting on their own. And by virtue of all the different specializations in baseball or football or American football or basketball, I'll bet you can come up with dozens, maybe even scores, hundreds of interesting players. And in tennis, there's usually like 10 at any given time, if you judge by press coverage. But there's got to be more than that. There's got to be interesting things to say about people like Yastrzemska and Lehechka and everybody right down the line, maybe even beyond the top 100. And that's what I'm trying to do by digging deeper into the stats and separating out how they play and what works for them and so on. And that's my project for 2024 on the blog.
I mean, with tennis and numbers, it does seem to be a sport that would lend itself to something like this, and a project like you've created. Like you said, you sort of got inspiration from baseball again, as probably a sport, a bit like cricket as well, I would suggest, where it is very much a numbers game, and we can look at a player and say, you know, what are they doing on the backhand? What are they doing on the forehand? We need to be careful with that. I think there's certain stats that do go out there and can give us a false idea. Pressure points being one of them. I see them coming up with, well, it's no surprise that the person who's losing a tennis match may actually do better on so-called pressure points than a person who's winning. Why? Because they're under pressure a lot more, because they keep going down 15-30 or 15-40. So at the end of the match, they may have won 75% of their pressure points, but they lost the match overall 6-4, 6-4, 6-3. And the other person may have only won a small percentage because they only faced 3 pressure points in the so there's some of them out there a bit like that, but there's a lot of stuff out there, you know, that I guess we can hone in on in a black and white way, and like you can with baseball. Soccer, one of my biggest passions, is I think it's still, a really tricky thing to nail down. It's being used more than ever before, but I still, if you could get soccer into a black and white scenario, you would have almost no failures in transfers, because every transfer would be worked out and you would never have £100 million flop, if that makes sense, Jeff.
Yeah. I mean, the one key difference is between team sports and individual sports. And the reason why analytics has caught on so much more in team sports is because there's an incentive there for team owners, team managers to dig in. Because if you are Manchester United or the Boston Red Sox or whatever, like, you will succeed if you figure out how to value the players on other teams, the teams that you could transfer, you could purchase in a transfer, or you could buy in free agency, or you could draft or whatever. I mean, that's why these teams have invested so much money in it. In tennis, like, there's a lot of numbers you can look at. There's a lot of interesting stuff to do, but there's not really the incentives. I mean, it's fun for me to do it. Maybe if you're Adidas, then you want to look at 16-year-olds and evaluate, like, which ones are most likely to be successful and that kind of thing. But there's no, unless you're doing like fantasy tennis or DraftKings or whatever betting things people do, like, there's no incentives there. Like, you can't put together a dream team of Yuri Lehechka's power and somebody else's serve and somebody else's second serve. I mean, you could do it, but it would be kind of pointless. And that's the equivalent of like building a good soccer team or a good baseball team. So you kind of just have to keep, unless you're betting, you kind of have to look at it as a fun, illuminating thing, not something that's going to like revolutionize the sport. Because unlike what it's done to baseball and other sports, it's not going to revolutionize the sport. It might change what coaches and players talk about somewhat, but it's not going to change the fundamentals of how the sport works, how players are chosen, who wins games and stuff like that.
You say that, Jeff. What about coaches, data analysts, and strategists? Particularly, say, if you don't have one of those in your team because you're ranked 230 in the world. Can I go on your website if I'm coaching, one of those people in the 200-300 bracket, and maybe find out something about my opponent or my player's opponent, for example, that I just don't know them very well because they're ranked 400 in the world and I've got one YouTube clip of them. That's it.
It depends on the player. If it's someone who, well, let me tell you a little bit about the match starting project. What I started about 6 or 7 years ago, called the match starting project. And what I and a whole bunch of other volunteers do is we log every shot of professional matches. So every shot is a forehand, backhand, volley, whatever. Serves, what direction do they go? Returns, what directions do they go? How deep are they? Every shot, what shot is it? What direction does it go? So you have this shot-by-shot log of now almost 13,000 matches. So if you want to do an in-depth study of how Novak Djokovic, as I see on your screen there, how he's been playing lately, you've got it. We did it for you. Not every single match, but over 500 career Novak Djokovic matches. You can dig into how often he's hitting a forehand, how often he's hitting a backhand, how often he goes different directions, how often he hits his returns deep, how often he serves wide in the ad court, and so on and so forth. If you're doing all this for Mats Kazanowski, I don't have the data for him. I'm sorry. I don't think I have any matches of his. So it depends a lot on the player. I mean, there are some players who are outside of the top echelons who are pretty well represented, like someone like Brandon Nakashima. I think I've got a dozen of his matches. I've got 1 or 2 matches for hundreds and hundreds of guys, but there's some limitations to how useful that's going to be. I mean, if I've got 1 match to show you from 2019, then I don't know whether you'd put a lot of stock in that going to a match tomorrow. But if you are that coach, then that's a place to check. And that's a place where you can find out what their tendencies are, what works, what doesn't, and maybe get a sense of where to attack.
I mean, I've just got the Jannik Sinner Djokovic match up here, which is possibly one of the most, recognizable or moments of the year so far. We're only, of course, 5 weeks in, but it is a standout match, not necessarily in terms of quality or drama, but, it's one of those ones that shook the tennis world because he hadn't lost there in a semi-final at all in his career and hadn't lost there for, I think it was 6 years as well. So all sorts of stats tumbled, if you like, historical ones with that match. But when you're watching, for example, a match like that Sinner Djokovic match, and bearing in mind, you're probably looking at it through a slightly different lens, or probably an entirely different lens to pretty much the entire watching world. Even some of the tennis nerds that hopefully they don't mind me calling them tennis nerds that I mentioned earlier, but even someone like myself who's got a vested interest in the sport, quite a big one, I would say. And I've got I think a pretty good knowledge of what's going on. But you'll be watching that, and you may be watching things in that first set, for example, going, wow, I don't think I've seen Djokovic do this before. Let me check. I don't think I've seen him do this many forehand. I mean, I'm just saying forehand errors because that's a lazy sort of reference to make. But do you know what I mean? Was there something you saw going on in this match, maybe even more so the first 2 sets, that made you want to go and check your website to see if that had happened before?
Well, honestly, for one thing, don't give me too much credit about watching tennis differently. But I don't do a lot of checking. I think I do a lot less checking of the sort you're talking about than some of your friends do. I'm more likely to be watching the match 100% and looking for patterns within that match that I can check later. So if I'm thinking, it looks like he's missing a lot of forehands, I might go check and see what the percentages look like. But I might make a note to myself that says, is Djokovic getting pressured on deep cross-court forehands from Jannik Sinner or something? And I'm not going to look that up now because I'm going to have to write some code to check that. But that's the sort of thing I'm thinking about. And I know full well that if I brainstorm like 10 things like that, maybe 7 of them will be non-starters, and they'll just be like the Sabalenka narrative I mentioned earlier. But maybe 2 or 3 of them will be.
Jeff. That's good, though, in a way. I mean, you're just testing it, and it didn't work, and then you move on, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's what you have to do. I mean, that's with any type of endeavor like this. Like, you got to have a lot of ideas, and some of them are just they're narratives that you dreamed up that now we're just going to pretend they had a better idea in the first place, or maybe they'll lead you to some other better idea along the way.
Right. Let's have a look. So I want you to sort of help me with your website and talk us through. I mean, let's just say, let's go back to the homepage, actually. Yeah. I like what you said about lefties earlier, because that just made me jot down a quick question that I could possibly ask you, which is Rafa Nadal, okay, a famous lefty himself, maybe the most famous of all. I'm on your homepage right now, and I want to find out how Rafa does against other lefties. Cam Norris springs to mind, but can I just find out in general what Rafa does against lefties?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're on my homepage in the player search box up there. Just start typing Rafa or Nadal, and you'll get to his page. And then I might actually have this pre-calculated for you. Let me see. I got so much on here, I forget what's here. Yep. So you're on Nadal's page. Click on career. You see in the upper right-hand corner, there's a whole bunch of links. One of them is to career splits.
Okay.
So click on career split.
Yeah. I'm on career splits now.
And then toward the bottom of that table, there's a line versus righties and versus lefties.
Versus lefties. Yeah, got it.
Yeah. So that's probably all you need right there. That's a lot of numbers for versus lefties.
Got it. So let me just have a look. So he's let's just have a quick look here. It looks like he's played, or you've got his last 52 matches. Is that against lefties? Is that right? Maybe all his 52 matches, or all of his career matches. Because I think your data goes back to 2005. Am I right?
The data goes back as far as all these players go back. It goes back to 1957 for men.
Oh, I see. Wow. Okay. So I mean, obviously Rafa's career. Basically, you got his 52 matches. It looks like against lefties. I want to just see. I see best of 3, best of 5. I mean, just basically all his matches against lefties. Sorry, excuse me, because I am a newbie to this page. Just where can I see basically, the number of wins and losses?
Let's see. I'm not sure what you clicked on, because I was trying to do exactly what you're doing, and I have a list of all of his matches against lefties. So
okay, I might have clicked on the whole thing.
Yeah, if you want to hit the back button and take us back to the Nadal's page.
Sure. Just a second. Let's just go on. Okay. Oh, maybe I'm checking the. Here we go. Okay, so I think I'm on his page now.
Yeah.
Can you see the page, by the way? Yeah.
Yeah. So if you click on career splits like you did before.
Yeah. Career splits. There we go.
So then you've got a table where the second to last line in that table of career splits shows you his overall stats versus lefties.
Just a second. That's probably where I went wrong before. If I go down year-end rankings.
I think you went too far.
Oh, did I? Okay.
Yeah.
Point by point, key games, key points, serve speed, last 52 weeks. Okay, yes, this is last 52 weeks. Okay,
and
right.
Then
okay,
just a little bit higher than that is the career split. So that's just showing. That's just a few matches for Rafa since he hasn't played very much last year.
Yeah. Okay, I got you. Okay, I think I clicked on last 52 weeks rather than his entire career. Career tour level splits. Okay, versus lefties. Boom.
Yep.
That's what I want. Okay, so 125 wins and 18 losses. That looks about right.
Yep.
Yep. Gotcha. So there we go. Go on.
And exactly. And then if you click that link, then, which I think is what you've clicked, then yeah, you've got a full list of all of his career matches versus lefties.
Got it. Yeah, Jack.
That's all of them.
Yeah. Oh wow. So this is all 143 matches he had against lefties. Oh, Lopez was a lefty. I didn't even think about that one. Wow. So his first ever match against a lefty. Sorry for this in 2002. He won. Yeah. So he didn't lose one until he lost to Mariano Puerta. So his first dozen, or a bit less than that, maybe 8 or 9. Including a guy called Scott Draper as well. Okay, cool. All right, cool. That's nice. In fact, it looks like he lost. It looks like his 3 losses against lefties, if I'm reading this right, all came in the first couple of years of his career. So this is just me getting an. Oh, it looks like he's lost 4 there to Gitchils Muller. Oh, because he's lost 18. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Okay. All right, cool. But still, he's got a pretty good record against lefties as you just. But he did lose against Cam Norrie last year. Of course he did. Okay, excuse me. I'm just going off. I'm just rabbling to myself here. Cool. Tell me something else that I could just suddenly go to on your website that you think might be quite interesting for the casual observer.
Well, what we can do is we can keep drilling down from what you've got there. I mean, if I see you went back to the homepage, but let's just do this we can just do this with a different player. So maybe we can pop over to Swiatek. So
yeah. So if we
go to Iga Swiatek's page.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So that first page that pops up, that's sort of an overview of all sorts of different overviews of ways of looking at the player. If you want to have a list of matches you can filter, there's that link that says complete filterable results underneath it's on the upper right hand side.
Just a second, upper right hand side.
Beneath all those other
links. Oh yeah, recent results. Did you say? Oh, career?
No, complete filterable results, and then there's at the very bottom of that table you're looking at.
Okay, recent results.
Oh, sorry. No, don't scroll down. It's at the closer to the top.
Yeah, just
Our,
up here.
Yeah.
Oh, here we go. Go straight to the classic player page.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So then what you have there is that defaults for modern players to a list of their matches in the last 52 weeks. So right now you've got Swiatek, she's 69-10, pretty good. What's one thing we could do? All these things in the left-hand column, head-to-head, exclude op, time span, surface, all these things in the left-hand column, those are all the filters. So if you wanted to see, like, let's say you wanted to see all the tie breaks she's played this year.
Yep.
So if you see in the left-hand column, there's something called scores. So just click where it says scores.
Just a second. Where are we? Scores. Here, yes, scores. Click on this one. Yeah.
Click on scores.
Tie breaks. Yeah, all tie breaks. Yeah.
Yeah. So just if you click on all tie breaks.
And this is over the last 52 weeks. It's now showing me all dozen or so of her tie breaks. 14, it looks like. Winning 10 and losing 4. Am I right?
Yep. And this is sort of a quirk of the way I present the site, but that's a match one-loss record. There's not an easy way to get the tie break one-loss record. Sort of.
But that's actually a common thing that we will lean on, to be honest with you. We will say, as a match is erring toward, or a set is heading towards a tie break, 5-all, 5-6, 6-all, or whatever, we are then thinking, what are they doing in tie breaks? Particularly recently, I think we do sort of look at the last 12 months and, 10-4. I mean, I don't know. 10-4 sounds like a good record, but I guess maybe if you're world number one, you would expect to win more than lose. Are there players with tie breaks that spring to mind that you know off the top of your head where they've been phenomenally successful? They are world number one and winning Grand Slams, and yet that tie break record doesn't quite. Because if you're one of the best players in the world, you're still going to play tie breaks from time to time. I guess winning 2 out of 3 would kind of be normal, right? Does that not sound about right to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I've done actually a lot of research on this over the years, and that's exactly right. That the better player you are, the better you'll do in tie breaks, for the obvious reason that you're the better player. Like, even if someone drags you into a tie break, you're still a better player than they are. They've just managed to hang on for 12 games. So you won't, if you're Djokovic and you win 85% of your matches or whatever, you're not going to win 85% of your tie breaks, because tie breaks are usually against better players. They're shorter, so there's more luck involved. You could just have a bad 10-point string, but you will win more than half. So what you can do is you can take how good are players against the players they're playing tie breaks against, figure out those ratios. There's a lot of math involved, but you can figure out what their tie break percentage should be. And what I found in general is that virtually everybody, in the long run, they play tie breaks as well as they should. Not better, not worse. Like, you figure out what that number is, that's what their tie break percentage is going to be. John Isner outperformed. He did better than he was supposed to. Roger Federer outperformed. He did better than he was supposed to. But for the most part, players are who they are in tie breaks. If there's any pressure, it's facing the other guy too. So it evens out, and there's not really players who are better or worse than you'd expect.
Do you think, I mean, Isner's an interesting one, because it is a casual observer's thought, is that actually going into a tie break, a huge server, that might just be a moment where, they can just hang on to their serve for their 7 points and pick up a point somewhere else, and boom, they've won a tiebreak, or hang on to their serve 6 times perhaps. Does that kind of make sense to you, that a big server maybe, that again, it's a kind of a casual, that's sort of what I'm thinking, that maybe they've got a slightly better chance in a tiebreak than they would have across the match?
Yeah, that was the first question I tried to answer when I started digging into this, and they don't have an edge. And the short reason why is that players who are big servers, they have big serves, but they generally do not have good returns. So yes, you're right. They have a good shot at holding on to their serve for every point, but their opponents also have a very good chance at holding on to their serve for 7 points, because someone like Isner or Opelka or Karlovic is bad at returning. So for the most part, it's all what you'd expect. They aren't better or worse. The one factor that might be what makes Isner better is that virtually every player is a little more conservative in tie breaks. Players win fewer serve points in tie breaks. And in one way, that can work against a big server, because that makes them a little more fragile. But on the other hand, if someone like John Isner isn't serving at 100% all the time, because he doesn't have to, then he can stay at his level rather than being more conservative. He's conservative enough the way he already serves. So he manages to retain the power of his serve, whereas most players end up giving up a little bit because of pressure, because of tactics or whatever. So that may explain why he's better, but that doesn't apply to big servers in general.
Couple of questions here that spring to mind. You mentioned how actually your serve is a little more vulnerable in a tiebreak. I think you suggested there. In other words, what I'm understanding from that is that throughout a set, let's say you hold serve throughout, so that'll be you're winning 4 points on your serve in each service. Oh, well, that depends, of course, if it goes beyond that. But let's just say, what's a rough percentage in terms of an average game? Doesn't matter if it's 3-3, 4-2, or whatever. Are you winning about 70% of your points on serve, 60%? What's the percentage on that normally?
Yeah, for men, like if you're winning 70% of your points on serve, you're usually holding them. I'm not sure exactly what it translates into, but you might get broken once, you might get broken 0 times. You're usually holding. So for women, someone like Sabalenka will be at 70% points won sometimes. And then if you're 70 throughout, like, oh wow, David Goffin here, he really took something off the serve in the tiebreak. It's not that easy to recognize, but over the long haul, it is like 1 point out of 20 that the returner is winning in a tiebreak that the returner is not going to win earlier, because either maybe it's because the server takes a little bit off of it, maybe it's because of the pressure, or maybe it's because the returner is really focusing. Because I mean, there are points in a set where the returner just kind of phones it in. Certainly something like Isner phoned it in sometimes as a returner, and he didn't do that in tiebreaks because he knew he couldn't. It could be that everybody is a little bit like that, but it's probably some combination of those things. It's just a consistent thing that servers are a little more vulnerable in the tiebreak.
Let's go to another tennis cliche that we can either confirm or lock up today or put it to bed. Is the deciding set. So third set throughout most of the year, and third set, of course, for throughout the whole year for women, and fifth set for men. Serving first, is it an advantage?
No. And anytime I say no, I'm saying like it could be like 2% or something you'd never, ever notice. I actually don't remember. Some of these things are some of the first studies I ran, and hopefully I've gotten a little smarter and savvier since then. So maybe if I did it again, I'd get a slightly different answer, but basically no. One of the common themes running through all these things is I think we tend to focus on one particular player being under pressure. And anytime one player is under pressure, usually the other one is too. So, I mean, it's nice to get ahead. And I mean, I think that's the cliche, right? The advantage is you serve first, you get your number on the board. The other guy's always playing from behind. But
and there is the other thing, Jeff, is that you don't have those pressure moments when serving at 4-5 or 5-6. And in the olden days, when you used to go on, you just constantly have that, you know?
Yeah. I mean, the story makes sense. And it's just that any of these pressure points, like the returner's under pressure too. It's tough to convert a match point, even if it's tough to save them. So I don't know what the psychological answer should be. I just know that analytically, it doesn't show up in the data, that there's not really an advantage there.
Jeff, this is something that you might not know or even looked into, but it's something that has run through my head a few times in the last year or two, is when you go love 40 down in a game. So this, I don't know if you can ever look into this somehow, somewhere, if you haven't done so already, and I'm guessing you might not have done, but whatever. When a server is love 40 down, male, female, whatever, 3 sets, 5 sets, I would be intrigued to know which of the 3 points in the next 3 is the player most vulnerable. So what I mean by that is we need to look at a million breaks of serve, okay, or as many as possible anyway, and they all have to have stemmed from a love 40 scenario, if that makes sense. Now, are you more likely to get broken at love 40, 15, 40, 30, 40, or in that fourth one? I don't know how that would be done in a black and white way, because already as I say this out loud, I'm already starting to think to myself, how can you do that? Because you go love 40 down, you get broken. Well, there you go. I just wonder if there's a way of getting that down in a black and white sense without having any contradiction in there. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I can see why it would be tough to come up with a black and white answer, because if the majority, not the most points are going to be at love 40, is right. If the player breaks at love 40, then the game's over. So there's fewer 1540 points than there are love 40 points. If a player gets back to 3040, then they're probably a better player. So they're probably more likely to, it's probably a better server, I mean to say. So maybe the returner isn't as good. Maybe the love 40 was kind of flukish. So yeah, it would be tough to control for all that. But it's not something I've looked into, so I don't have an answer for you.
Yeah, it's tricky. I have to think this one through a bit more to get because you're right. The control is the key point. All right, let's go back to your website. Let's see if we can find some other fun things. I just need to do this. Okay, cool. Let's go back to the home.
If you still got IGA up there, I was going to say, if you've still got IGA there, one thing I wanted to point out is, so for one thing, at the page you're at right now, there's a link at the bottom of the list of matches that says show career, and that's almost always there. So you were talking about the value of having a list of the last 52 weeks worth of matches, which is great. But anytime you've got the last 52 weeks, you might want to compare that to the career. So if you look at that list of matches, go down to the bottom of the list below the Indian Wells match in March. Yeah, show career, and then hopefully it works.
Okay, great. So initially we just had the tie breaks for the last 12 months, but if you just wanted to just jump to her entire career, you can easily do so. And when we look at her whole career, it actually feels similar to the last 12 months in that she's winning 35 and losing 20. So the percentage barely changes.
And the main thing I wanted to point out staying here is that there's all these filters, any one of those black things with a little arrow next to them on the left-hand column of the page, and you can combine them. So right now we're looking at all the matches with tie breaks in them. If you find the filter where it says surface and click on surface, and then a menu of surfaces comes up.
You could just click on her hardcourt tie break record.
Exactly. So now you've got two filters in place. You're looking at just hardcourt matches, just ones with tie breaks in them, and you can combine as many things as you want.
You could do.
So you could go from here and find like against lefties or against Belarusians or whatever.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Actually,
that's why I started out by saying, like, I encourage people to experiment with this, because there's something like, I don't know, there's 12 filters, and maybe the average menu is 5 or 6 items. So there's probably a few thousand variations of this page you could look at. Most of them are kind of silly, but if you want to figure out how you can be like the Tennis Abstract power user, you just have to mess around with it and see what these.
That's what I mean. So right now I've got back to her tie break record. How would I look for her tie break record against left-handers?
Let's see. Down at the bottom of the list of filters on the left-hand column, there's one called versus hand.
Okay, just a second. Versus hand, yeah. And then you just click left, I guess. And maybe, there we go. So she's got her entire career. She's won 5 out of 6, it seems. Yeah, Vondrousova. Yeah, of course. Yeah, Hadamar as well. Okay, cool. Yeah. All right, let's go to the home page again. I think I've clicked on the right button. Actually, before we just have a look at another thing on here, I actually want to ask you a question or a thing that comes up a lot between tennis fans, I would suggest, which is a lot of criticism is aimed. I just saw the head-to-head thing on there and just thought of something. A lot of criticism is aimed at the ATP and WTA websites. WTA maybe slightly more, but I know the ATP's just recently had an update which has annoyed a few people and they don't like the new one, but that could just be a case of change, but whatever. What are your thoughts on their websites? Do you find them frustrating when you're maybe looking for something, or do you never visit them, or what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I don't end up visiting them a lot because, like I said at the outset, I built Tennis Abstract to be the site I wanted. So if there's something that I want to look up a lot, I hopefully have it on my site, so I don't need to go anywhere else. But no, I mean, there are pros and cons. I mean, there's a lot of times where, honestly, if you're writing a newspaper article or doing TV commentary, you should be using those sites instead of mine, because you need the official numbers. Like, there are mistakes in my database. There are things that don't behave exactly the way you expect them to. So if you want to say something that is maybe not 100% true, but at least like validated by the proper authorities, then like you should be getting it from the ATP or WTA websites. That's just a fact. The problem is with it kind of goes back to what I was saying about team sports versus individual sports. In team sports, there's this immense interest in stats because they are so consequential for team building. In individual sports, that's never really happened. I mean, I can't speak too intelligently about golf. I know some cool things are happening in golf analytics, but people just don't focus on the stats in the same way. So if I was the ATP and I was thinking through my priorities in terms of where to spend money, what to put on my website, who to hire, stuff like that, I know that in my little world, those people would all be like, yeah, all the stats, all the analytics, all the time. But in the broader world, if you put me in charge of the ATP with the priorities of that person for the organization, I don't know if I care that much. I'm just being honest about it. I personally care a lot, but I'm not sure that the average tennis fan does. Maybe we'll get there in 10 or 20 years, but I think the average person clicking on the ATP site is not looking for anything very complicated, very detailed at all. And a lot of the things that people go in search of, you can find easily on the ATP site. I think it's generally fine for what it is. That's not as true for the WTA site. I think there's more glaring holes on their website because they've prioritized it even less. But even there, like you can generally find what you need. It's just if you want to drill down further and do these filters and get detailed stats, then those aren't there. Or if they're there, they're not accessible because they're just not prioritized. And that's why I built the site I did. But I think that the priorities are just so vastly different.
Right. Just having another look at your homepage here. I see we've got some of the tournaments, of course, happening right now in Linz and Montpellier and Hua Hin. I see you've got favorites here and percentages. I think we're at the final stage of all of these tournaments. So I'm guessing, for example, Borna Coric, is that the same, suggesting he's the favorite against Bublik tomorrow? Is that what that is, 59% more or less?
That is right. Yep.
So where is that percentage? Where's that coming from? Is that coming from gambling sort of percentages or is there some kind of algorithm or thing going on there that I'm not aware of?
There is an algorithm. There's a rating algorithm that originally came from chess called ELO ratings. And if you read very much on my stuff or follow on Twitter,
I saw as well, even just recently in the last few minutes. Here we go. We've got the ELO leaders. Tell us about this.
Yes. What ELO ratings are is they're a way of rating players based on who they play, like who they beat, who they lose to, and that's it. That's the entire thing. I mean, the math is a little hairy, but it's the only thing that goes into it is who you beat, how good they are, and who you lost to, and how good they are. And if you think about the differences, that's a pretty wild difference from the way that the official rankings are calculated. Like, I don't take into account, or ELO ratings don't take into account whether it's a Grand Slam, whether it's the fourth round, whether it's the final, whatever. It's just, if you beat player X, you get points for beating player X. If you lose to that player, you lose points based on how good they are.
Do you get more points for beating Novak than you would Dimitrov, for example, or?
Exactly. Yep. You get points based, more points for better players. You get some points for beating a lesser player, and then vice versa. If you lose to a really bad player, you lose a lot of points. If you lose to a good player, you lose a little bit of points. And if you think about it, it's kind of like a ladder at a tennis club. Like, if you win a match, everybody knows you're a little better than they previously thought. If you lose a match, you're a little worse than they previously thought. And this just tries to capture that intuition in a mathematically sound way. And the punchline to all this is the ATP and WTA official rankings are pretty good at forecasting match results. Like, I forget what, I did this experiment years ago, but something like 65 or 70% of matches are won by the player who's ranked higher. Maybe it's more than that. I don't know. It's pretty good because better players are better players no matter how you measure it. But ELO does better. If two players are, like, let's say, I don't know, if one of them is 5 places higher on the official rankings, but 5 places lower in the ELO rankings, they're more likely to lose the match. ELO is more accurate in forecasting how the match is going to go. Not every time, because it's small margins. It's always small margins in tennis. But if if you were betting on tennis and your only choices were to bet on the official rankings or bet on the ELO ratings, then you go with ELO. It's head and shoulders better. So that's why I rely on them. And then with those numbers that you see there, there's another formula you can use to combine the two numbers, and that'll give you the percent chance that the better player wins the match. So that's how we get 59% for Coric and 41% for Bublik.
Does it not take into account surface, I guess, though? It's just
it does take into account surface.
So the percentage, for example, let's just say Sinner versus let's just think of a combo here. Okay, yeah, Sinner Tsitsipas might work on a clay court. I would imagine right now that might be, just off the top of my head personally, and this is just a personal judgment, if they play each other in Monte Carlo, it might be 50-50. If they played each other on a hard court in Indian Wells, for example, I would probably lean quite heavily towards Jannik Sinner right now. But I don't know whether... So would your stats kind of change as well for the Indian Wells match compared to, say, Monte Carlo, where Tsitsipas has also done pretty well, for example?
They do. And if you... I see you've got the screen queued up to where it shows the ELO leaders on my front page. If you click on that link that's at the bottom of the men's list where it says all men's ELO ratings...
Yeah.
That gives you the full rankings, and there's 3 columns where it says H ELO, C ELO, and G ELO. So they're in about the middle of the page, or the middle columns on this table.
Okay.
H
yeah,
ELO,
sorry. Okay, yeah. Hard clay and grass, I guess. Yeah.
Yep. So we can look at this directly. So in the H ELO column, that's for hard courts. Sinner is about 2,200. Tsitsipas is 1,920. So that's a gap of 280 points. It's a pretty sizable gap.
It narrows
on clay
on clay.
ELO, 2075 on clay to 1985. That's a 90-point gap. That's pretty narrow. So it would still make Sinner the favorite because actually, no matter what his clay results are, the clay ELO rating takes into account his overall results, because that proves to be predictive, but it's only part of it. So yeah, Sinner is massively more a favorite on hard courts than on clay.
Got it. Yeah. Cool. Okay. Nice. Let's go back to your homepage and let's see if we can find 1 or 2 more little things that might be of interest. What else would you suggest that somebody might be surprised? Or let's maybe have a quick look at something historical here. The greatest players. This is something we should talk about before I let you go, because I think this caused a lot of Twitter discussion. The 128 greatest players of the last century. And of course, we had Rod Laver won. Let's just have a quick look at the men's here. So we've got Rod Laver, Djokovic, Federer, Bill Tilden, who I'm sure many people are not familiar with, and Rafa Nadal. So that's, I think, the sort of top 5 men's. Tell us about this, sort of the way you came to these conclusions, or with these numbers. How do they work out like this?
Yeah, so I'm glad we talked about ELO a little bit first, because there's an ELO component to this. And the basic idea that informed this whole thing is, for one thing, we don't talk a lot about era comparisons in tennis compared to other sports. Like there are all-time great lists, but it's not an obsession the way it is in baseball. And I've always been curious. And part of the problem is there just wasn't data. Like if you want match results for Bill Tilden or really anybody before the Open era, they're pretty hard to come by in any organized fashion. So I spent about a year trying to whip that all into shape, and then put together an algorithm and tried to estimate how good was everybody at their peak, how good were they in every individual season they played, and then how good were they in every season over the course of their whole career. So I put together this algorithm that tried to combine those things into a sense of how good were they as a player, combining their peak along with some sense of how they were across their whole career. I didn't count like the typical things like titles won or Grand Slams, because when you get down to the bottom of the list, or even the middle of this top 128, you just got a whole bunch of people tied at 1 or tied at 2. And some slams are cheaper than others. Like Roy Emerson won all of his slams in the 60s when all the best players in the world were pro. There's so many ifs, ands, or buts about the major titles, and you end up with so many players tied with 2 or 1. So by looking at peaks, by looking at career totals, I got something a lot more fine-grained, a lot more detailed. And the results are what you see here. And some of it is super counterintuitive, and that's some of the Twitter discussion, as you kindly put it, that came up. I know a lot of people were were very angry or confused or celebratory, depending on which name came up when.
Celebratory is the one that made me laugh most, Jeff, because I can just imagine people dance. Steffi Graf fans, you know.
Well, you know what was fantastic is that there's a British tennis message board. I forget what it's called exactly. I think it's like British Tennis.active board or something. I forget what it's called, but there were a group of people there following this project very carefully, and of course they were mostly interested in the Brits. So I mean, when Kitty McCain came out at number 94, that was a big deal, and Ann Jones a few steps later. And even at that point, people were talking about, when is Andy Murray going to arrive? Like, is Andy Murray going to be better than Fred Perry? Are either of them going to crack the top 50? And I swear it was just like I unrolled this thing over the course of a whole year, and week after week after week, somebody was saying, like, where is Andy Murray? How are we not? Andy Murray must be coming soon. And as we got into the top 50, into the top 40, these guys they were really excited about it. It's like, oh my God, Andy Murray made the top 40. And then we keep counting down, and he ends up at 29. And I might not have a lot of new friends among Rafael Nadal fans, but I think I have some new friends among Andy Murray fans. We'll leave it at that.
Yeah, gotcha. But it also reminds me of, you're talking about some of these Brits chatting that will not even have been born when some of these players were happening and doing their stuff. But it reminds me of once I was in a class during my masters. And I can't remember exactly the reason why, but there was a particular cricket match between India and Pakistan in the 70s. And it was relevant to the discussion that we were having about the political environment at the time. And it was done with complete irony, but it was very funny because it showed me how humans are. These two girls were like, who won that match? And it was Pakistan won. And they were like, yes. It didn't matter at all because it was a match like 20 years or 15 years before they were born. But they were doing it in an ironic way. And it did make me chuckle because we are kind of a little bit like that. We're like, let's just say England football team. And you mentioned a match in the 20s. And I go, well, did England? Oh, yes, England won. Okay, great. Even though it was 60 years before I was born. But yeah, back to this Twitter thing. Yes, I know certain fans of certain players, possibly even Novak fans. But actually, let's actually hone in on one thing here. We've got Steffi, Martina, Serena. And it's just to sort of flesh out what you said kind of at the beginning about how you came to these conclusions. Steffi and Serena 23, but I might be wrong by one or two there. And of course, so therefore Serena fans. And I know you did say, look, we don't look at that. We just look at match by match. So tell me, why is Steffi 2 and Serena 6, for example?
Yeah, at the top of the rankings, a huge amount of it is just pure dominance. And when you're comparing eras in tennis, for one thing, it's really, 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 really hard. I mean, I think anytime you're comparing eras, you just have to start with that acknowledgement. And you can't try to compare, like, what if Steffi were playing today, or what if Serena were playing back then? I mean, if you do that, then, like, objectively, the best players are playing now, give or take 5 or 10 years. Like, Iga has better training, better equipment, better everything than any other woman on this list because she's playing right now. We have to somehow cancel that out. So the solution basically is how dominant was a player. And Serena, of course, was tremendously dominant, and more so than anybody except for those other two women on the list. But she just wasn't quite as dominant for as long. I mean, she missed more time. She took more time off. She lost more inexplicable matches to players who she shouldn't have lost to. And again, we're talking about like a dozen, maybe over the course of her career. It's not many, but Steffi didn't do it. I mean, Steffi she had a couple of years in there where she just won. Same thing with Martina Navratilova. She had a year where she was like 84-2 or something. I forget the exact number, but they just didn't lose for years on end. And Serena, for all of her greatness, wasn't quite that good. And that's much more a testament to just how outrageously dominant Steffi and Martina were than anything about Serena. It's just their standard was so high. And it's the same reason the Laver is on the top there too instead of Djokovic. I think a lot of people think I'm crazy for putting Laver ahead of Djokovic, but Laver at his best was at a level relative to the field anyway that no one else has ever touched, even Djokovic, and probably no one ever will. And that's the difference.
This is sort of going off a little bit away and into maybe something that's not quite so data related, but the debate over, you mentioned, of course, where Iga is at in terms of the training that she has, the professionalism, the team around her, investment, the things at her disposal, you know, whether it be whatever she consumes for breakfast, lunch and dinner and everything else in between, and diet and training and everything and equipment that she has available, and the fact that she'll be flying first class to all these tournaments and so on and so forth. I could keep going on with all of this. And so she's somewhere close to whatever the 100% is ready to win a tennis tournament, probably every time she turns up. But players in the 50s, 60s, 70s, you know, classically the soccer one, and I'm sure it could apply to tennis too, you know, they would be having steak and chips for lunch and then going out on the football field and then drinking plenty of beers afterwards and so on and so forth. But something that I am equally convinced about is that the chances that Steffi Graf, for example, would have been successful in this era and Iga Swiatek would have been successful in Steffi's era, we don't have a lot to go on other than the fact that they've both been phenomenally successful in their eras. They both had some God-given gift. There's no doubt about that. And assuming that they both got the same opportunities in those two particular eras, all the evidence we have suggests that they would be as successful or somewhere very close to that. You know, it's like Pele in soccer compared to Messi. Yes, the Brazil team or the Argentina team of today take the field against the Argentina or Brazil team of 20, 40, 60 years ago. The one today win, but they've got so many advantages that this team don't have. But the actual natural gift that they had. So almost certainly Pele would have been successful if he was born 50 years later, and same with Messi 50 years before. All the evidence we have in front of us suggests that. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think that's true, that of any sport, any endeavor, the very best in past eras, they're going to be fine now. The one twist I'd put on that is in sports, and this applies to tennis, where a lot more people have the potential to play than used to. And I think this is especially true for women. So I'm not sure exactly where I'd put what the curve looks like in terms of how many women have the opportunity to play tennis. But I've spent a lot of time researching amateur era women's tennis. And two things were happening. One, way fewer women ever picked up a tennis racket or ever played seriously. A lot of them played at a club, but it wouldn't have crossed their mind to play a competitive tournament or travel to play a tournament. And then on top of that, the social mores were such that if they were good, they would still get married at 22, have a kid, and quit. So all this talent was just removed from the talent pool, on top of all the talent that wasn't there in the first place, combined with the fact that if you go back to the 1930s, let's say, most of Eastern Europe wasn't playing tennis. Russia wasn't playing tennis. I mean, huge swaths of the world basically didn't have competitive tennis in any form. So now you have basically any woman in the Western world at least has access to a tennis racket and maybe a tennis club. I don't know, over 100 countries in the world, they could get access to a tennis club and at least some rudimentary coaching. So the number of people who are potentially a number one, if they have those natural gifts and if all the luck that needs to happen to get them there, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people who, like, if things break right, if they have the natural gifts, they could take it all the way. If you go back to the 1930s, or just say 100 years ago today, I'm not even sure we're in the millions. There's so many reasons why people never would have made it, things that would have stopped them before they even could have gotten started. So if we look at Bill Tilden, we're saying Bill Tilden was the absolute very best for a decade out of this population. Novak Djokovic is the very best out of a decade out of a population that's 100 times bigger. So maybe there's 100 Bill Tildens for every one Novak Djokovic. I think that's a fair argument. I don't know what to do with that in terms of ranking players, in terms of comparing Tilden to Djokovic, but I think it's worth keeping in mind that, I mean, the people who are doing it now, they're the cream of a vastly larger crop.
And Jeff, it might and hopefully will get even vaster in years to come, because I still think tennis access is I mean, I'm glad you touched on the West there, because I think that's a huge thing when we look at even just where the 4 Grand Slams take place, but also, of course, across various social classes. Although you mentioned Bill Tilden, the player that did spring to mind, and I think we can maybe just finish by talking about her, is Margaret Court, because whenever the topic of greatest women's players comes up, her name does come up. but then there's the conversations and the things such as Patrick Mouratoglou pointed out recently in terms of, you know, when she was playing, who she was playing against, how often she was playing, and you know, the fact that she maybe didn't have such stiff competition. Do you sort of concur with that, or do you say, look, her stats stand up as good as anyone else's?
Well, yes and no. I have looked at this pretty deeply. This is right in my wheelhouse. It's definitely true that her competition was weaker. She's got the 24 slams, and 11 of them, I think, are Australian Opens. So yeah, in those 1960s Australian Opens, the draws were 32 or even 28. She mostly played fellow Australians. They were a little better than people think they are, because often like 2 or 3 of the top 10 in the world were Australian, and there was always every year but one, there were a couple of visiting players. So it's basically like the top 2 or 3 other players in the world would show up as well. So they weren't total cakewalks, but yeah, I mean, it wasn't like the Australian Open today. And let's keep in mind, my tennis 128, I didn't look at Grand Slam totals at all. Like I counted those matches, but it wasn't like I gave her credit for having so many slams. And she comes out at, let me remind myself, 18th of all time. So I mean, that's my final crunch the numbers answer, is with all those adjustments for era, Margaret Court is 18th of all time and Serena is 6th of all time. So I mean, that's a clear edge for Serena. Margaret Court gets knocked down because of the era, but apart from the fact that all those Australian Opens were cheap, she won a whole bunch of Wimbledons. She won like over 100 other tournaments. She had a winning head-to-head against virtually everybody on the planet. And we're talking about some really good players like Billie Jean King and Yvonne Goolagong and Rosie Casals, all players who were on my list. I mean, she just dominated people. The year I just spent last year writing about 1973, which is 50 years ago last year, she went 78-2 for one stretch after coming back from giving birth. Like, I mean, it's just wild, the level of dominance. Like, even if you wipe out 50 of those matches and say, okay, the competition was easy, or some of it was in Australia, take away 50 of them. So she comes back from giving birth and goes 28-2. That's still pretty darn good. So, I mean, the reason why I get worked up about this argument is I think people take it too far. Like, it's absolutely true. She faced easy competition because of the era and because of all of her time in Australia. But that doesn't mean she wasn't great. She was absolutely one of the greatest of all time. You just have to knock her down like half a peg because of those circumstances.
We have had, I say we, talking tennis, we've had 2 people on this list on the show. So I'm quite pleased about that. We've had Pam Shriver and Michael Stich on the show at some point or another. And fingers crossed we get 1 or 2 more. But I have got another one, and it comes down to this list, and if I understand the maths correctly, would a player, their stats get punished, for example, by, let's just say Novak wins 2 more Grand Slams, which at the end of their career, you know, looks amazing. But if he played for 4 more years to do so, and obviously lost dozens of matches en route, would that potentially move him down below Roger Federer in this list, despite the fact he's adding to his title haul?
Not the way I set this up. No, you can't go down. So
Novak could play 100 matches and lose every one, and he can't go down on this list.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And I will say, I wrote something at the end of last year. This all took place I published all this in 2022. So these are all end of 2022 rankings. Okay. But then I looked at it again at the end of last year, and with Novak's excellent year last year, I'm provisionally saying he moved up to number 3. He's actually ahead of Martina Navratilova now. And you can also see in the hundreds, I've got Iga Swiatek sneaking in there at 101A. She didn't make the list when I first did it, but when I recalculated the numbers at the end of last year, she did qualify. So I don't want to kick anybody out writing long and thoughtful essays about all these people. So I'm not moving anybody off the list, but I do want to give Iga credit for where she belongs. But the way the math works is like those ELO ratings I'm talking about. Any season where a player's ELO rating ended under 1900, so about top 20 in the world, I don't even count it. I just throw it away. If you're outside the top 20 in the world, it doesn't really contribute to your greatness. Like what Andy Murray is doing right now, it might tell us something about the man, but it doesn't tell us anything about the player at his best. Like he can keep doing that for as long as he wants. He's going to keep his place on the list. He's going to have to be a lot better to move up the list, but no, he's never going to move down. Nobody's going to move down. unless Iga beats them, I guess. And Iga would have to
Yeah.
take over to knock anybody down.
Yeah, cool. All right, Jeff, wonderful. We've had an hour together, and I mean, we could spend decades together, perhaps as long as some of the people have been playing. Fingers crossed we cross paths again at some point in the future. But Jeff, trust me, your website will get plenty more visits from us at Talking Tennis as we sort of lean on some of the stuff there. But not too obscure, like I say, just some of this sort of fifth set, even lefty stuff. You know, some of the stuff we've touched on before actually is it's not as obscure as maybe some people think. That we do lean on this when we're, you know, going into the fifth set and into these tie breaks, and even just looking at the head to head. And yeah, just want to say a big thanks for coming on board today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, John.
If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell so you don't miss out on all things tennis.